do you suffer fear at all when flying? And if so, how do you deal with it?
Well, firstly, Mari, fantastic pleasure to be with you here in Oxfordshire and to be participating in your programme. Tremendous honour for me. The flights, fear, yes. I mean, fear of flying, of course, on some level. Weirdly, if I feel fear, it's generally on the ground, not when I'm in the air. So it is purely a kind of irrational reaction, which I'm sure is shared by many people. But no, in the air, I don't feel frightened. It's true that you're in your element. I have this tremendous affinity with the aeroplane. I love the aeroplane. This is the passion of my life. So no, I love being in the air.
Right. So no fear in the air, but fear on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's just some kind of,
before you fly.
Sometimes, yeah, it's sometimes because you just don't really know what you're up against. I mean, you're obviously very exposed. This is a vintage aeroplane. It's open cockpit. You're exposed to the elements. The weather is always the single biggest risk with this because you're slow moving. My aeroplane cruises at about 85 miles an hour. You're slow if you're dealing with headwinds, crosswinds, turbulence, rain, airspace, procedural issues. There's a lot going on in this environment. So it's quite a hostile environment.
Right. So for those who have never been flown, particularly in vintage airplane, could you just explain what is the 1942 Stearman biplane?
The aeroplane is an absolute classic. I mean, I've spent 30 plus years flying vintage aeroplanes, and that was my great passion. I didn't really want to go the conventional route, which would be flying multi-engine modern aircraft and getting into the airline, for example. I had a very romantic view of aviation, and it came about actually from watching some of the older films, and I just simply loved the idiosyncratic element behind these funny old aeroplanes, these funny old flying machines, which seem to have a personality of their own. Yeah. So it was an entirely different skill. And in some respects, I'm unusual because there's very few people get to fly these aeroplanes anymore, but it's all visual flying. You know, when you think of the modern world with all the technology and the glass cockpit where you're flying by computers and all the rest of it, this is very physical, hands-on flying. There's no autopilot. I have no real instrumentation in the aeroplane. I have to do this visually. So I have to fly in good weather. I have to be able to see the ground and the horizon. I can't fly in cloud or very bad weather. I can't fly at night. So this is what's called VFR flying, visual flying according to visual flight rules. But it's very physical. It's very hands-on. I have a range of just under 400 miles in the aircraft, which means that I can stay in the air about 5.5 hours before I have to land and refuel. So with all of these expeditions, there were many, many landings. I mean, the flight from England to Australia through 23 countries, 62 stops. So this is a huge logistical exercise, planning this, getting the overflights, the permissions in place. We had to be virtually self-sufficient in what we carried in terms of tooling, spares. Often we carried the fuel as well for my aeroplane. So you can't just take this aeroplane anywhere. There are no resources and there's just simply nothing for an aeroplane like this in a modern international airport. So we had to have full self-sufficiency in our crew, as well, of course, as filming it.
Yes.
We wanted to document this as a historical exercise.
So planning becomes paramount for success in this journey. And good team.
Fantastic team, fantastic support. So the sponsorship and political support behind it was very critical. So I started off, I was very, very fortunate to get the Boeing company on board. This is a 1942 Boeing Stearman. Boeing produced tens of thousands of these airplanes in the late 30s as primary trainers for military pilots. So it's a very basic airplane. It's a very rugged airplane, very strong, and it's almost agricultural in its use. In fact, not only was it a very successful primary trainer, but after the war, it was used as a crop duster and, in fact, a barnstormer. So it's a very, very iconic aeroplane. It's a very handsome aeroplane.
But you're right. It is romantic, rather, isn't it?
It's very romantic. Of course it is. This is the old-fashioned adventure, and that's what it was meant to be.
Right.
And you fly aeroplanes like this, you become immersed in the history of the aeroplanes. and in the history of flight itself.